Welcome, everyone. We will begin in 2 minutes. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Elizabeth Szynski, Director of Business and Community Operations at the Wisconsin Policy Forum, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to another installment of our virtual policy discussion series, Forum Friday. We have so much to discuss today, but first, I'd like to quickly acknowledge our Forum Friday sponsors. Brookfield-based Community Care serves the long-term care and health needs of more than 12,000 older adults and adults with physical and intellectual disabilities across 15 counties. With 24 offices globally, including Madison and Milwaukee, the law firm of Foley and Laudner seeks to understand its clients' priorities, objectives, and challenges to provide them with successful outcomes. WIS Politics is a long-standing Madison-based nonpartisan news service that provides insider information to subscribers and stages events for the public in Madison, Milwaukee, and Washington, D.C. The service also includes wisbusiness.com, various podcasts, and the statewide Upfront TV show. And thank you also to the Zilber Family Foundation for its support for today's program. Next, a word of thanks to the forum's strongest financial supporters, our pillars of public policy: A.O. Smith, BMO, Northwestern Mutual, Potawatomi Casino Hotel, Rockwell Automation, Spectrum, and We Energies. And thank you to our sentinels of civil conduct: JP Morgan Chase, Johnson Controls, and Von Briesen and Roper SC. Finally, the forum's work is supported by hundreds of corporations, nonprofits, local governments, school districts, and individuals throughout Wisconsin. Our members help us provide data-driven, objective research and discussions to inform policymaking in our state. To join the forum, go to our website, wispolicyforum.org, to learn more about membership benefits. And with that, let's begin today's Forum Friday. Before we hear from our guests, Forum President Jason Stein will discuss our recent research on municipal and county board budgets, including the increased numbers of referenda they have been putting before voters. Jason, take it away.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And thanks to our sponsors, guests, and our panelists. So to get started, we'll bring up the first slide, which is going to show you when you see it. It's going to show you some of the financial challenges that local governments have faced in recent years in Wisconsin. The first is regarding property taxes, which is their biggest source of revenue. Property taxes, the portion of that used for operations in Wisconsin, has been limited going back to 2011 to the annual increase in property values in their communities due to net new construction. Typically, that's 1.6 or 1.7% a year in Wisconsin on average across the state at a time when, inflation has been well above that. Also, shared revenue, which is the main form of state aid to both local governments and counties, has also lagged in recent years. Now, there's been one big increase in 2024 that we're going to talk about, but for 2 decades prior to that, it had not kept up with inflation. And then cities and villages in particular in Wisconsin have a limited palette of revenue options. So income taxes, sales taxes, those are typically not allowed for cities and villages in Wisconsin. Room taxes are allowed, but most of that revenue has got to go towards promoting tourism. And then local governments have also just faced accelerating costs due to inflation in recent years, as well as turnover and vacancies in employees that have put pressure on them to increase staff salaries. In our next slide, it illustrates for you what I talked about with regard to increases in shared revenue. That's the green line. First, you can see how it lagged for many years. Most years over the past generation has not increased or has actually gone down during recession years. But that changed with the passage in 2023 of Wisconsin Act 12. And that legislation increased shared revenue payments by $275 million. If you look at two of the main components of shared revenue, which is county and municipal aid plus utility aid, those actually went up by more than 30% in 2024, almost a third. And that really did provide a significant change and source of assistance to local governments. So, one question that you all might have is, okay, so why are we even having this Forum Friday on local government referenda? And the answer is that assistance from Act 12 really varied by community, as we can see in the next slide. Here we're looking at cities and villages in the state by population. And so on the left bar, it's communities with less than 1,000 residents. And there you can see the dark blue bar is what they historically received in county and municipal aid, which is the main component of shared revenue. And then the light blue bar is how much of an increase per capita they got from Act 12. So you can see those smallest communities in Wisconsin got an increase that was, not quite doubling, but a very significant one, $71 per head. If you look at the largest communities of 20,000 residents and up, they saw the smallest increase in per capita shared revenue aid of $26 per resident. And so that kind of shows you for big groups of municipalities how the aid really varied, but it varied even more widely if we look at them individually, as we will in this next slide. So this is a teeny tiny bar for every one of the more than 1,840 cities, villages, and towns in Wisconsin, and how much per resident they receive in total county and municipal aid under both the legacy payments that were the dark blue bars in the previous slide and the new payments that were the light blue bars. So you can see some communities like with Madison, around $30 per resident. And then some of your smaller communities with low property values are seeing hundreds of dollars in total payments per resident. So, some other communities on the low end besides Madison would include, communities like Germantown, Wanakee, City of Franklin, Mequon, Hudson. These are higher property value communities. And then, other communities like Milwaukee, Racine, Beloit, you'll see larger shared revenue payments. If we go to the next slide, one question that we frequently get asked is, well, how could those shared revenue payments differ so much per resident across the state? And the answer is that both in terms of the historical program and the recent change from Act 12, it tended to benefit local governments, small populations, low property values, and large previous payments when you look at the current payments. And there's smaller payments going to communities with large populations, high property values, and low previous payments. Now, historically, the idea of shared revenue was we're going to help out the communities with low property values. We're going to help them to pay for what they need, even though they don't have, it's harder to do it with taxing their residents because of their low property values. And the wealthier communities are just going to be able to raise property taxes by the amount that they need to deliver the services that they want. But in the current world where local property taxes are limited by the state in terms of their increases, that sort of disrupts that historic approach that the state had. And so in the next slide, we'll just talk about what are communities doing in response to all these factors that I've just named. Well, an obvious one is tightening their belt, making cuts, avoiding new spending. So some examples of that would be, closing libraries in the evenings or on Sundays, or if they have a rising number of EMS calls, emergency medical services calls in the community, the community leaders may want to add another ambulance to make sure that response times don't rise, but they may hold off on doing that. Another thing that communities may do is they may turn to borrowing more. They may, in the past, have used borrowing or use cash, to pay for new police cruisers, and they start borrowing the money to do that. Or they may delay making repairs to streets or other infrastructure. They may turn to fees or other local taxes like vehicle registration fees and increase those. They may look at ways to do service sharing and consolidation, which many communities have worked with the forum to do studies on that. And then, one of their last options, which, we've going to talk about today, and one of the ones that communities usually wait to implement, is to actually go to referendum and ask voters to increase their own property taxes to help pay for local services. So that brings us to the part of the program that you all want to see. I'll bring on Mark Sommerhauser, our communications director. And I should say we have one final slide that looks at what happens for those referenda. And you can see that in recent years, from 2018 and on, they have increased. The numbers in 2022, for example, 29 referenda, we had 23 in 2024, and they reached a total of $39 million in that last year. And that, mainly comes from the city of Madison with a $22 million increase. So, in a community of more than 1,800 municipalities, there's still a relatively small number. But when we see communities like Madison, Middleton, Kenosha, Oconomowoc, and Marshfield increasing property taxes due to referenda, we know it's a phenomenon and a trend that's worth following. So I'll leave it to Mark to bring on our panelists and start our program.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Jason. Again, my name is Mark Sommerhauser. I'm the forum's communications director. And, local government finance is really one of the pillars of our research here at the forum. Jason, just kind of went through some of our findings over the last couple of years, but we do encourage everybody to check out our research. If you go to our website, wispolicyforum.org, and click on the research tab, you can find out lots more that we've looked into around local government finance and many other topics. So, real quick before we do plunge into our panel Q&A, I do want to remind everybody that we'll be doing our audience questions at the end of the program. If you already have a question in mind for one of our guests, you can actually submit that right now. You can just go down to the bottom of the screen and click where it says Q&A. And you should be able to submit a question right there, and we can put that in the queue. And we do actually encourage folks to do that ASAP, so we have a nice queue of questions ready to go when we reach that portion of our program. So now, without further ado, let's turn to our panelists today, who each bring their own background here in the topic that we're going to discuss. And our first panelist is Monona Mayor Nancy Moore. Welcome, Mayor.
Thank you.
All right, I see you there. We're also joined by St. Croix County Administrator Ken Witt. Welcome, Ken.
Good afternoon.
All right, thank you. And lastly, we have Stevens Point Mayor Ken Wiese. Welcome, Mayor Wiese.
Great. There we go. Thank you.
There we go. All right, welcome. We're so glad to have all of you with us here for Forum Friday. And we all got to hear from the Forum President, Jason Stein, here about some of the fiscal pressures, some of the factors that have come to bear on our municipalities and counties throughout the state that have caused more and more of them to go to referenda. And we can kind of throw all the charts and figures and things that we want at people, but we think it's also really helpful to have the local government officials that are dealing with these issues day in and day out at the office. And so I'm curious to hear from each of you, and maybe Mayor Weasel, we can start with you and we can go kind of around the horn. Why do you think that municipal and county property tax referenda are becoming more prevalent? Why are we seeing more communities take this pretty big step of asking their voters to increase their own property taxes in these referenda?
Well, sure. The simple answer is we're running out of options. With state shared revenue traditionally declining, costs of everything going up. You talked about earlier the levy limits. When you're restricted to spending by the amount of net new construction, we've had good years and bad years. And Stevens Point has been generally doing very well, above the state average in a lot of cases, where we're getting 2.5%, sometimes even 3% net new construction. But when costs are going up 7%, and you've got a workforce that you need to provide reasonable salaries for, it gets tougher and tougher and tougher every single year. We are proposing a budget at the end of this month that is the 6th straight year of 0% increases in their operational budgets, because everything that we have is being diverted to some of the rising costs that we have to deal with. Contracted employees as well as our regular employees, we've made a priority to at least provide a cost of living increase. Now, to give you an example, this past year, we had net new construction of about 1.6%. The cost of living is about 2.6%. So you're operating, I mean, you're coming into the season with a 1% deficit. So having that 0% increase for now 6 straight years is really forcing us to look at options. We talked about wheel tax, but really that's just putting more burden on the city taxpayer. Property taxes are one of our only sources of income. We talked about transportation utilities, but all of those just really involve putting a bigger share of the burden on the taxpayers. What we'd really like to see is getting that shared revenue formula fixed and getting us back to where we're supposed to be. Now, I know that we talked about this earlier. You're going to talk a little bit later about the shared revenue increase that was granted to communities last year, but it's not an increase. It's just giving us more money back from the stuff that the state has already taken. I hate using that word increase because it sounds like they're doing us a favor, but in reality, they've taken so much and retained so much at the state level that municipalities are forced into situations. Stevens Point just last year had a referendum to hire firefighters, not an operational referendum for the overall levy, but just to hire specifically additional firefighters to make sure that we have the ability to keep the community safe. Now, it passed, but not all communities are that lucky. So when your options are being whittled down every single year, an operational referendum is one of the last resorts to get people to say, yep, I'm willing to pay for these services. And those are tough to get past.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Mayor. Let's kick this one over to Monona Mayor Nancy Moore. What's your perspective? And we're going to drill down, by the way, on each of these 3 communities, kind of their specific referenda, what the deliberation and the lead up was to putting that on the ballot. But again, starting at the kind of statewide level, the broad view, Mayor Moore, what's your view on why these municipal and county referenda are becoming more common?
Sure. Well, I would certainly echo a lot of what Mayor Mike has said, and I would just add that the city of Monona would kill for 1.5 or 1.6 net new construction, and it's not because we're not constructing. The city of Monona, in addition to all the other pressures that were just mentioned, we're a community that's landlocked, surrounded by Madison, and we don't have any place to sprawl. So all of our construction is infill. And as I'm sure many people here know, when you're doing infill construction, it's a lot more expensive and it takes a lot more time. So we can have some years where we're certainly developing and redeveloping, but we actually end up with a net figure that's negative rather than positive because of the expense of demolition and preparation of any kind of sites. And so that's really, and I think, a lot of individuals, a lot of residents don't understand too that think there's a pretty good, because of the number of school referendums, I think the residents have a pretty good understanding that the schools have been squeezed, but I think there's far less of an understanding of the kinds of things that were just discussed in your first slide, and that Mayor Mike also mentioned, that have really squeezed municipalities over the same period of time.
Sure. Okay, thank you, Mayor. Ken Witt, County Administrator with St. Croix County. Obviously, counties, there are a few differences. Counties have some other revenue options, such as the sales tax available to them, but a lot of these same themes, I'm guessing, are going to carry over into the conversation about, the kind of county perspective. What's your thought on why more counties, we're seeing more of them now going to these referenda?
Yeah, it's the reasons explained. When your cost, the inflation is higher than your net new construction, your revenue coming in, you cut services. And so we've run out of services to cut. And so we're just out of options other than to going to the taxpayers and asking them to increase the property tax.
I think now would be a good time to talk about each of your three communities, and maybe Ken will just go back with you and then kind of go back in reverse order. Talk to me a little bit about your county's budget situation, the lead up to this referenda. I understand there was one prior for you guys. What was kind of the lead up, and how did you arrive at the point where your county board, held that vote and decided to take that question before voters?
Yeah, it was really just the buildup of demand for services. Our county's doubled in size in the last 30 years. But the pace of growth of the employee base wasn't keeping up with that. So really, we looked at public safety. We hadn't added a road deputy in over a decade, but you could see that the call volume was increasing. So those deputies were working harder and harder, and they'd be 6, 7 calls deep before they could get to a scene. So we really identified there's definitely a need there, which was beyond the ability of our normal budgeting practices to do. So in 2023, we put forward a referendum, which really asked for everything that our public safety departments needed, the courts and district attorney and medical examiner, and the sheriff's office, which was 24 positions and was a $3.5 million ask. That was defeated, and it was just a few points off, but it was defeated. So we came back 2024, then that's when the state gave us the additional revenues, which was helpful. It actually paid for a big chunk of what that was. It was a one-time fix, though. It got us part of the way there, but didn't get us all the way there. So we went back with basically the balance in 2024 then to referendum to ask for 8 more positions and 896,000. So I think the fact that the second ask was smaller, lower dollar amount, we just tipped the scales and got over the 50% and got it approved in 2024 then.
Very good. Mayor Moore, let's go to you next. What brought this Monona to the point where your council was ready to take that vote to put that question on the ballot?
Yeah, well, we just ran out of runway, going into COVID, keeping up with our basic operating costs was already challenging, very challenging. And honestly, Mononans expect a high level of service, but our staff compensation was not keeping pace. We have really good staff, and frankly, they've stuck around because they love working here. But there was no question in our mind that their compensation wasn't keeping pace. Post COVID, with the rise of inflation, it just became too much to bear to keep, to hang on to the talent that we had and maintain the services and the compensation that our staff deserved.
Okay, thank you, Mayor. I feel like that's a common theme that we hear in a lot of our conversations with local government officials is, they'd seen some of these pressures building, and then the inflation of the post-COVID period really was, for some communities, kind of what brought things to a head. So definitely a theme we've heard elsewhere. Mayor Wiese, talk a little bit about what brought Stevens Point to the place of putting their referendum on the ballot.
Sure. It really came down to the fact that, as I said earlier, we were out of options. Ours came down specifically. First of all, let me say that I think I speak for everyone here with every single department could use more staff and more resources. But in this particular case, we run a firefighter paramedic operation, and the number of calls for service over the last decade had more than doubled. And that's just it's not necessarily population growth, but it's the volume of calls and the variety of calls. We have an aging population, so there's lift assists and things like that, but you never know what you're going to find. So you have to send the two paramedics out. And in some cases, if it's sudden cardiac arrest, we send another two paramedics. But because we're also firefighters, they respond with a fire unit. So with the calls for service more than doubling in the decade, positions had been approved, but funding just wasn't available. Same with our law enforcement and other places where the positions get approved, but then there's no funding for them. So we just didn't have enough staff, and we were literally paying out more in overtime than we would have been for salaries. It was just insane. And we talked about doing an emergency services referendum where it was police and fire, getting them both up to where the positions had been approved. And it really came down to politics in this case. Everybody loves the firefighter, right? They're the ones saving the kittens from the trees and the duckies from the storm drains. And they're the ones that are there to help you, arguably on the worst day of your life. Law enforcement is doing the same thing. However, there's mixed reviews about that. Some of them say they're over militarized, and some see them as oppressive. And we made a political decision that we would split it out to give our chance a better chance of success on the firefighter referendum. So the firefighters and the police chief was okay with it, at least for now, going strictly on a firefighter referendum. And it was a fair amount of work. The union put in a fair amount of labor trying to get support. And in the end, ultimately, we were successful. But what that means is, as I said earlier, you're putting more burden on the taxpayers. The counties have the benefit of having EMS outside of the levy limits. If we could get the state to do something like that for cities and villages, it would help. It's not going to solve all our problems, but every little bit is going to help.
Yeah, thanks, Mayor. The focus that Stevens Point did with your referenda on, in your case, was firefighter and paramedic, but I would say more broadly public safety. We're seeing a lot of these referenda kind of focused, within that area. How important in your mind was making that sort of narrower pitch to your voters to say this is where it's going to go, these are the services it's going to go to, as opposed to perhaps a broader sort of pitch that it would go to city services more broadly? How important was that in your mind in its passage?
Absolutely critical. And you still see that, right? I think every administrator or city leader here can attest to that. Not everybody likes where we spend money. And we frequently have those arguments like, well, why are you wasting money on bike lanes? Or why are you wasting money on this road? I don't even use that road. When you do a generic or a more generic levy referendum, you're going to get more opposition because there's someone out there that doesn't like one piece of what you're spending money on. They're going to say, well, cut that first. Why are you providing homeless services? Or why are you, I can't even give you more examples. They come up every day, though. So I think by narrowing it down and saying, listen, we are not asking for this broad reaching, let's just raise the levy and spend more money. We need it very specifically for 9 firefighters and their equipment to serve the people of Stevens Point. And when we narrowed it down to that, I think people could wrap their heads around that. I know what this is going for. I know it's not going to be used for something I don't like. And I think that was the key to making ours successful.
Good. Let's go back to Mayor Moore on this one. I would love to hear you talk, Mayor, a little bit about some of the outreach that you did within Monona to kind of inform, to field questions from your residents. Talk to me a little bit about that process. And I think you had mentioned previously that maybe there was a survey that was part of that process as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So we, as I indicated earlier, we did in a sense, a pre-referendum survey. to basically test the waters at three different price points. One of the challenges for municipal referendums, as opposed to a school district referendum, is that you have to do the referendum has to be bundled. In other words, the school can lay out a referendum and say, we only need, as an example, we only need 1 million in this year, and then the next year after that, we're gonna, we need this much, and the next year after that, we need this much, and so that's all they're putting forward on an annual basis. Residents know in advance if it's a multi-year referendum what's going to be added to their taxes on an annual basis. In Monona's case, in municipal case, if you're doing a multi-year referendum, that all has to be bundled. So we had to do a lot of estimating of what it would take us. We didn't want to go out for referendum year after year after year. And we could only provide the referendum question can only be $1 amount. It can't be multiple dollar amounts. So we had to do a lot of estimating up front of what we would need. And then in terms of outreach, we started with a survey to determine which of three price points our residents would be most comfortable with. The first price point being, this is what it'll take for us to maintain our service levels at their current levels and compensate our staff at the current at a competitive level. The second being a slightly larger figure, adding a few staff, assuming that we wanted to add some staff over a 4-year period. And the third being larger still. And from that survey, we learned that residents only had a stomach for maintaining the current services. And so that was instrumental because without that knowledge, we might have gone to a higher figure in hope that we could convince our community for those extra positions, and clearly the interest wasn't there. So in terms of overall outreach, I would also say that we immediately put everything up on the website. We had FAQs. We had very active public engagement. Including public information meetings and postcards, 3 different postcards that went out to residents. And, we have multiple media that we use. We have our own radio station, so we had regular spots and interviews being done on our radio station. We have monthly newsletters. We had constant social media being pushed out on it. And we had a farmers market booth, and we had one-on-one meetings with residents, and it was all hands on deck. It was not just those. It was not only the city council members that were available to respond, but also the city administrator and various other staff members to respond to individual resident concerns. So, and not to mention support from our public safety unions and other organizations within the community. And we even got some residents who were supportive of the referendum to come out and support with testimonials and willingness to talk to their neighbors about the importance of the referendum as well.
Interesting. Okay. Administrator Witt, you also had a public safety focus with your referenda. It was kind of your community's sort of second try at this. Talk to us a little bit about, the significance of that public safety focus with your referenda, as well as what type outreach was done prior to the vote that was held in, I believe it was the spring election of 2024. Is that right?
Sure.
Yeah.
It was. So we looked at public safety really for one main reason. We thought it would be something easy for us to explain that people would understand. So there's a lot of other social work programs that we do that probably wouldn't resonate as well or people wouldn't be as familiar with. So we picked a topic specific to the ease of explanation. Also, there's a lot of data behind it that's easy to support it, the number of calls, the number of deputies. And so there's a lot of statistics that we were able to use then to support that. So when we went to referendum, we did a lot of speaking tours. We went around and talked to Lions in Kiwanis and Chamber of Commerce groups, um, local cable channels. So we tried to get the word out as best we could. We tried to be as neutral as possible, though. You'd never hear me say, we want you to vote for this. Here's what you get for it, and here's what happens if you don't vote for it. Um, so that was the main outtake that we had, and the website and FAQs and everything else that came along with that.
Good. I want to bounce this one back to you, Ken. One thing that's interesting as we kind of take the statewide view on these referenda is how whether these referenda pass or fail doesn't always conform to some of the expectations that folks might have when we look at partisan voting patterns throughout the state. St. Croix County, it tends to be a red county. It tends to vote for Republicans. You got a pretty solid passage, about 8 points of a passage for your referenda. Talk to us a little bit about what do you think that tells us about what voters are willing to support as it relates to increasing their own taxes, and how in some cases that can kind of challenge some of the narrative about what Republican voters will tend to support versus what Democratic voters will tend to support.
Yeah, I don't know that we looked at it so much from the partisan perspective of who was going to vote for what. I think the big difference for us really was the ask in 2023 that was, 3 times as large, and then we came back the next year with a much smaller ask. I think they go, oh, all right, well, we'll be okay with the smaller one now that you brought it down. So instead of being smart like Mayor Moore and doing the survey ahead of time, we did it by trial and error to see what wouldn't work and then figured out what would work. That was probably the biggest difference for us, though, between the the referendum and the approved referendum.
I do just want to put in another quick plug here before we do a few more questions. We are seeing some audience Q&A coming in, some audience questions, and we have a team here that's kind of pulling some of those together. But again, if you're an audience member, you have a question in mind, now would be a really great time to submit that. You can just click that Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen and get that in the queue right now. Would be perfect. Let's go to Mayor Moore, and clearly you had a little bit of anxiety probably on election night here as we see the outcome with your referenda, 32 votes. And refresh my memory on what the population of Monona is.
About 9,000
About
people.
9,000. Okay.
Yeah.
So almost 10,000 residents and 32 votes really being the margin there. What was your feeling about what made the difference? Clearly, the survey is one piece that you talked about, kind of taking the temperature of maybe what your voters were willing to support. But to what do you attribute that outcome?
Well, I think a few things. One is that we worked really long and hard to plan the referendum. So I really recommend that people think about, I mean, we actually thought about what election we needed to shoot for, and part of our decision making around that is that we didn't obviously want to have a referendum at the same time that our school district was having a referendum on the same ballot. So we worked really hard to decide first what election were we going to be having the referendum, and we worked backwards from that date to make sure that all our ducks were in a row in terms of the kinds of pre-work that we needed to do, the kinds of data that we needed to pull together to be able to respond to questions. Um, we hired a third party to do a compensation study so that the residents weren't just taking our word that our salaries were, and it wasn't straight comparative data. We weren't just saying the Parks and Rec director at the community next door is getting paid this much and our Parks and Rec director is getting paid this, and so therefore in order to make them comparable, we did a much deeper dive into our compensation so that we could confidently say to our residents that the kinds of increases we were asking for were based not only on position title but position responsibilities. Because of course we all know that from community to community, the responsibilities can differ significantly depending on the size of the community. Um, So again, spending multiple years before we got to referendum doing that kind of homework. Our active community engagement certainly, I think, really helped. We also emphasized public safety. While this wasn't totally a public safety referendum, we certainly stressed the value and the impact on our public safety personnel, both fire, EMS, and our police department, of course. Um, we made it pretty clear that what the impact would be without passage, which we didn't threaten to say we're taking the pool away if we don't get this. It was never anything that specific, or exactly what library hours would be cut, but more that these would be likely places we would go if the referendum didn't pass. And again, Mononans not only expect high services, but they really value the services that we provide to them. So I think that was really, really important. And of course, we also emphasized, and this goes back to what Ken was saying in terms of the size of the referendum, I think, we emphasized what kind of cost savings we had already done, or we're undertaking, even as the referendum was happening, to help residents understand that we had been minding our P's and Q's, and that the kinds of resources we're requesting truly were needed. We were not being sloppy with our finances.
Very good. I'm seeing a couple more questions trickle in through the audience Q&A, but let's keep those coming here as we're going to try to get to those probably in about 5 minutes or so. Mayor Wiesa, we talked a little bit in our presentation here about Act 12, 2023 Act 12. It was obviously a very significant piece of legislation for local governments throughout the state, but as Jason touched on, that aid was not doled out evenly, and some communities saw a lot more, and it does seem like the smaller communities did see a little more of a per capita benefit from that. What was the impact of Act 12 for Stevens Point? What did it do or not do from the standpoint of kind of putting your community's budget of finances on a more sustainable path?
So first of all, I'll start by saying everything helps, but it to varying degrees, right? With Act 12, it assisted in trying to help us balance the budget, but as I said, we were still at a 0% increase. We needed to keep wages competitive, and we tried to maintain that cost of living. We've done very well with that since then, because if you start cutting the employees' salary and benefits, you lose them to everybody else. And then you have problems further getting the work done that people expect, because now you have staffing shortages. I will say that let's use an analogy. They after a 3-day fast, it was a bite of whatever pie you like. I'm a pumpkin pie guy. You get a bite of pumpkin pie. It's not satisfying, but it's good. I know there was a question out there, so I'm going to try and be preemptive and answer that because it ties into this. As I said, with the state's formula for shared revenue, it needs to be modified. It needs to allow communities to not put as much emphasis on borrowing and referenda, but yet allow reasonable growth. Now, that's going to get abused in some cases, I know. How does that work? I really don't have a good answer, but I think we tie it to the population of each community, and somehow get into the economic development of that, putting a factor in perhaps for shared services. When those things all come together, I think that gives a pretty level playing field. Now, I'm not a numbers guy, so I couldn't tell you what percentage of what, but using those things to show and reward the communities that are really doing well on providing the services without wasteful spending, and not put so much emphasis on that growth. We're maxed out on our TIDs because we need that growth. And it counts for net new construction, although it doesn't really help your taxes. It counts as net new construction. So we need to stop relying solely on the property owners in our communities to bear the weight of that burden. We need an equitable share of our shared revenue that we turn into the state or our population turns into the state. We need to get that back to a level that is sustainable for most communities.
Appreciate you going into that, Mayor. Actually, a couple of the questions that we're getting now are around the shared revenue formula. So let's hold that thought for right now, but I want to get back to that in our audience Q&A because that seems to be where a lot of our audience members are wanting to have a little more conversation. Mayor Moore, Act 12, what did it mean for Winona? What did it do? What did it not do?
Yeah, well, Mayor Mike's analogy was a pie. My analogy would be more like a tourniquet. Which is to say, that our Monona received 231,000 in shared revenue in 24, which for our budget was a huge boost. Um, but that same year we had zero net new construction because of the challenges that I talked about in the beginning, right? And so, excuse me, while the 231,000 did allow us to maintain current services, that that was a one-time fix. It didn't solve the problem longer term, which is exactly where I think the mayor was going. Um, and so since 2024, just to give you an idea, the increases generated by Act 12 haven't even come close to keeping pace. The 25 increase was only 7,750, and in 26 it was a little over 12,000. So that doesn't even cover the cost of increases for our public safety personnel. Never mind other operating expenses that we have, and of course, there's a maintenance requirement that was tied to Act 12 as well, which is added expense to our police and fire departments, just to maintain their level of training and service. So it was a tourniquet, but it definitely did not solve our problem longer term.
Very good. And Ken, you want to talk a little bit about Act 12? What did it mean for St. Croix County?
Sure. We had a deficit of growth in our personnel base. And so it helped offset part of that, but not all of it. So it got us part of the way there, but not all of the way there. So like the mayor said, it's a one-time fix. Those monies are invested year after year in those personnel. So there's no new monies. And the indexing that they have on that is, as the mayor said, very incremental and not enough to shift our budget in any significant way.
All right, we are getting into the last 15 minutes here of our program. So now is the time, audience. If you have a question, please put it forward at the Q&A. Hit that Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and we'll try to sort through these questions here and get them posted to the panelists. We got one question here that I think is pretty quick, so I'll just throw that one out there to start. This person is wondering if any of these communities use a communications firm to assist in the education or outreach effort. Is that something St. Croix County did, Ken?
We did not. So we looked at it that we didn't want to spend taxpayer dollars to go ask the taxpayers for more money. So our total budget was under $5,000. And we did as much as we could in-house. But that's why.
Makes sense. Mayor Moore, how about you?
We did. We don't have well, we have a variety of media. We don't have a communications director or even a part-time communications director. It's really for individual departments. Falls under other duties as assigned. And we wanted to make sure that there was a consistent message that we could obviously do a tremendous amount of community outreach, as I spoke about earlier. And we also wanted to keep an arm's distance from the process. And as Ken talked about earlier, and not be in a position where we were advocating one way or another for the referendum, but just laying out the facts. And so we thought having a contracted third party would work better for us.
Thank you, Mayor Moore. Mayor Weeza, how about you guys? Did you guys do the outreach and communications in-house, or did you bring anybody else in?
We did everything in-house. We
Okay.
have a community media department. So we ran videos. I did an interview show with the fire chief. We threw the statistics up on every social media platform we have to show the public exactly where the money was being spent and where it was going to be spent with a passage of the referendum. I would say, however, anything larger than that, just our firefighter paramedic referendum, if we were going to go for a general levy increase, I think it would be beneficial to have some sort of marketing firm. So you have, as the mayor said, that consistent message. But that's one thing that cities generally aren't good at is making sure that the public knows what's going on a day-to-day basis. We try and get out there and almost literally push it in their face that here's where we're spending money. Here's where, your tax dollars are going. Get involved if you want to see something change, but it doesn't work that well with our capacity. So I think a larger referendum, I think we would really strongly consider a marketing firm.
Good. So, again, as we look through the questions here, there's definitely some folks that are curious to hear your thoughts, the panelists' thoughts about what could be done in terms of the state's partnership with communities and especially in the area of shared revenue. Why don't we start with you, Mayor Weeza? Clearly, you've thought about this one a lot and have some specific ideas, and then we'll kind of go back around the horn. What would you like to see state policymakers do with respect to shared revenue? What are some areas that you feel like are kind of ripe for reform there?
As I said, I'm not sure what the formula should be, but right now, I'll give you an example. We had the combined services grants that were available through the states, and I pulled in leaders from every municipality in the area to talk about what we're doing now and how we could further collaborate to take advantage of these incentives. And the bottom line was we were all already doing it. I can't speak for what other communities do, but when it feels like we're being punished for running lean, if you will, and taking advantage of, I got to tell you, one of the big things is community support. A lot of the things that we have, we just are opening up a trail portion in our park system, $1.7 million, of which the city taxpayers contributed $0. It was a grant, and over $400,000 was raised privately. That's a huge benefit to the community, and we're doing that. There's no way that could happen under the current shared revenue formula. So, if there was a way that they could reward people for running a lean ship, combining services where you can, and not putting such an emphasis on grow or die. Um, that's I think the bottom line. I don't have the formula answer, but I would be happy to sit on any panel and invite any legislator to our community to show them what we're doing. And you show me where we can make improvements. Uh, Maybe that's what it comes down to, right? Instead of sitting in Madison, why don't you sit in the mayor's office for a little bit and see what happens there?
Yeah, so it sounds like you're saying kind of not hinging everything so heavily on net new construction, but adding some other factors in there that are going to govern those levy limit adjustments.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And a little bit of this, I don't want to seem to speak for them, but when the levy limits were put in place, I think it was designed to kind of curb the spending, right? There were communities that were, in someone's opinion, probably spending more than they needed to or not running as efficiently as they could. And those levy limits were put universally in place to try and curb that. But what it did is those of us who are running reasonably, in my opinion, and running a tight ship and looking to be good stewards of the tax money, we were actually punished for that, and we continue to be punished.
Okay. Mayor Moore, let's go over to you. What are your thoughts broadly about what state policymakers should be looking at, whether it's shared revenue changes or other changes in terms of, the state's partnership with our municipalities and counties? Do you have any thoughts there?
Yeah, so when I ran for mayor and when we were actually doing the referendum and then when I decided to run for mayor, one of the things that I got asked frequently was, we get that the problem is levy limits, But why are Wisconsin property taxes higher than in a lot of other states? Because they had children that lived in other parts of the country. And they wanted to know why Wisconsin was so much higher. And fortunately, I was able to go to the policy forum and the research that you guys had done, and essentially reflected the opening slide that you had in today's presentation, that I think is still very salient. I think it's a combination of the percentage of shared revenue that comes back to us, that is much higher in other states than it is in Wisconsin. There's an over reliance on property taxes alone, is what it boils down to in Wisconsin, I think. And so it's a combination of shared revenues. The other thing is, Monona is a small population with high property values and high expenses because we're in the Madison metro area. So, um, another piece is that there's only two jurisdictions in the entire state that have been allowed a slight increase in the sales tax. Um, Again, tied, as I understand it, to the fact that the legislature believed that those two areas, and those two areas being Milwaukee and I think Baraboo, the Baraboo area, because it's tied to tourism. Like Madison doesn't have any tourism. I don't think so. You know, um, or for that matter, St. Croix County or Stevens Point. And so, but even a small percentage increase in sales tax that could stay locally, I could see as being of value. And then, as again was mentioned in your opening slide, increasing our ability to generate own source revenues. You guys mentioned the wheel tax, but beyond the wheel tax, there's just not much there, where we can go again as dictated by state law. And if there was some flexibility there, that would be great. But overall, I would say that as Mayor Mike said, the challenge is that our residents are really tired of being saddled with property tax that is higher than other states. And I think that needs to be looked at even more seriously, because it's just it's unsustainable in my view. Um, Wisconsin's a great place to live. And our population's only going to increase, and the interest in people moving here is only going to increase, and yet the property taxes are really high. So those are just some areas, as I said, shared revenue, sales tax, own source revenues are some areas I'd look at.
That's good. We are almost out of time, so if anybody else in the audience has any more questions, get them over to us. Administrator Witt, what are your thoughts about kind of the partnership between the state and counties and municipalities? Is that on strong footing in the wake of Act 12 here, or is there more work to be done?
There's definitely more work to be done. There's only a few tax options, as Mayor Moore was explaining. You have income tax, which is a progressive tax. You have sales tax, which is a regressive tax, and then you have the property tax, which is a wealth tax. So with such few tools in the toolbox, we don't really have a lot of choices. I would go back though to the Kettle Commission from about 20 years ago. They studied this. They had the solutions, I think. There just wasn't the political will to implement them. There's too many winners and losers in trying to change the formula at this point.
Well, let's go back down to your community then, as we're kind of closing out. We've had Act 12, we've had the passages to referenda. Where does all this put St. Croix County in terms of its fiscal and budget stability and its position going forward? How do you feel about where your community is at here in the years to come?
Yeah, well, our community is one of the very fastest growing communities. We're just behind Dane County. We have a lot of room for growth here yet. Um, so we're usually towards the top of net new construction. We have strong sales tax growth, which really is indexed for inflation, because as prices go up, the sales tax goes up. So that's been a great growth area for us. So we're doing okay. We're able to continue to grow, whereas I know a lot of my peer counties are not able to do that. So we're very fortunate here, but we're barely getting by, and we're at the top. So.
Very good. Mayor Moore, what's the future outlook for Monona?
Well, I
From
would
a
say
budget
that we're
standpoint?
good. We're good through 29, which is what this referendum request was all about. What happens after that without seriously looking at the formulas and providing some other adjustments, I think is gonna it continue to be a great challenge. I mean, our redevelopment. I was chair of the plan commission for 6 years before I became mayor, and because we are in the metro area, our redevelopment has been really strong, and it really hasn't slowed down because of the economy. But even with that increase in density, we're, of course, increase in density means an increase in services, police, fire, first and foremost. And so I think those pressures are always going to be there, and we're going to need to see changes at the state level.
Mayor Wiesa, take us out here. What's the future outlook for Stevens Point from a budget standpoint in the wake of this referendum?
We're going to keep doing all the good things that we do. We have an obligation to the citizens. The one thing I can tell you we won't be doing is relying solely on the property taxes to get things done. It's getting to the point where you're going to be taxing people out of their homes, which contributes greatly to the housing crisis we're already in. You got a lot of seniors on fixed incomes, and they can't be continually burdened with additional property taxes. They can't afford to keep a home. So that becomes a problem. So we're going to continue to seek out creative ways, partnerships, to get everything that we need to get done. And most importantly, probably, is making sure that the citizens know what our challenges are, and open it up to them to help offer some solutions too. Because I got to tell you, from my desk, most of the best ideas come from outside of City Hall. And that's a big thing to note for those of you listening. Be receptive to those ideas. Don't demand them, but let people know what you're doing. This is the challenge that we have. You want the roads fixed. Well, we got 4 crews out. I put it on a GIS so you can see where the potholes were and where we fixed them. And you can see that we're not sitting around waiting for something bad to happen. We're out there working every single day to make Stevens Point a better place. I think I speak for every single mayor and city leader here. We're all doing the best that we can with the tools that we have. And come hell or high water, we're going to find a way to keep it up.
Right. Very good. Mayor Wiesa, Mayor Moore, and Administrator Witt, thank you to all 3 of you for joining us. I think we had a really great conversation today. That completes our program. And we appreciate all of our panelists and all of our audience members for tuning in. I do want to give a quick plug here before we leave. Our next big event coming up next month will be our 33rd annual Salute to Local Government event. That'll be on November 19th. And this is the forum is really our marquee annual event. We typically have between 400 and 500 folks show up at the Italian Community Center in Milwaukee to celebrate, just the positive impact that public sector workers have throughout our state. We just actually put out and announced our Salute Award winners that will be recognized at the event next month. But registration is still open for that event. You can visit our website, wispolicyforum.org, to sign up to attend that event and just learn more about the incredible Salute Award winners that we will be recognizing at that event. So please do that. And last, I would just say that in the polarized times that we're in right now, the Wisconsin Policy Forum promotes nonpartisanship and informed decision making. If you're not a member of the forum, please consider joining at wispolicyforum.org. Membership information can be found at our website, and you could please also follow the forum on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, or Instagram. That concludes our program today. Thank you again for tuning in, and we hope to see you at our next Forum Friday in the coming months. Thanks, everyone.